Welcome to Dead Scary Stories. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share and subscribe. Also comment where and what time you're watching from. Now lie back, relax and let sleep consume you. I stand by the tree line across from the petrol station, my back pressed against the damp bark of an old oak. The light spilling from the windows glows faintly on the wet tarmac, a halo against the night. Rain drizzles around me, whispering against the leaves, slicking my jacket, but I don't move. From here, I can see the cashier, a young man with floppy hair, leaning on the counter, scrolling his phone. He glances up every now and then, bored, checking for customers. The station is quiet, almost dead. No one ever stops here this late, that's why I chose it. A car skids into the forecourt, tires shrieking. It jolts to a stop and a woman stumbles out, barely getting the door closed before she's running inside. She's frantic, her movements sharp, like a bird trapped in a room. Her head turns once, scanning the dark as she bolts through the door, leaving it to swing shut on its own. The bell above it jingles faintly, almost drowned by the sound of her boots pounding against the tiled floor. She rushes to the counter, gesturing wildly. I can't hear her, but I don't need to. I know what she's saying. The cashier straightens, startled. He sets his phone down and leans forward, clearly trying to understand her. She keeps looking behind her, out into the night, and even from here, I can tell she's terrified. Her hands flutter in front of her, shaking like leaves. She grabs her phone out of her pocket and shows him something. His face tightens. He looks out through the glass doors, his expression cautious now, wary. I smile. This is where it gets interesting. The second car pulls into the lot, this one slower, gliding to a stop. In the space closest to the station doors, the headlights cut out, leaving the car sitting in darkness. I see the door open and a man steps out, dressed simply, jeans, a jacket zipped up to his throat. He doesn't look hurried, but there's a tension in his stride as he heads for the station, the door creaking open just as he reaches it. The woman steps back when she sees him, almost tripping over herself. She's speaking again, frantic, pointing at him, then at the cashier. The man stops a few feet inside the door, his hands held up like he's trying to calm her. His movements are smooth, careful. He's saying something too, but I can't hear him either. He points to her, then to himself. His head tilts slightly, like he's asking a question. The cashier looks between them, confused now, unsure what to do. His hands hover over the counter, undecided. The woman grabs at his sleeve, pulling him to her, trying to make him understand. The man at the door shifts slightly, just a fraction, his head turning towards the forecourt as though checking the lot behind him. Then he steps further into the station, his movements firm but not aggressive. The tension inside is rising. Even from here I can feel it. The cashier raises his hands in a placating gesture, trying to settle them. The woman backs up, grabbing something from the impulse rack near the register. A plastic umbrella by the look of it. It's flimsy, the kind that would snap in a breeze, but she holds it like a weapon, waving it at the man as she shouts. He stops where he is, staring at her, his face calm, unreadable. It's a strange tableau. She's trembling, wide-eyed, her face pale under the fluorescent lights. He's motionless, his posture neutral, but there's something about the way he's watching her that's off, too focused, too controlled. The cashier tries to step between them, hands out, speaking quickly now. His voice carries faintly, muffled by the glass, but I can't make out the words. He's trying to diffuse the situation, I think, trying to calm them both. The woman darts a glance at the door, like she's considering making a run for it. The man takes a single step forward, his hand still raised, and says something that makes her freeze. The cashier stops too, his face tightening in alarm. There's a pause. A stillness. Then she lunges forward, swinging the umbrella wildly, and the man grabs her wrist, twisting her arm sharply. She screams, the sound muffled by the rain. I shift my stance slightly, keeping to the shadows as I watch. The cashier yells something now, loud enough that I can hear the edge in his voice even through the glass. He reaches for the phone behind the counter, but the woman's flailing knocks it from his hand. It clatters to the floor. The man lets go of her wrist and steps back, hands up again, but his eyes are cold, his expression tightening. The cashier hesitates, torn between picking up the phone and keeping himself out of harm's way. I glance at the road behind me, checking for headlights, for any sign of another car approaching. There's nothing, just darkness and rain. When I look back at the station, the man has moved closer to the counter. The cashier is reaching down, his eyes flicking between them. The woman is breathing hard, clutching her wrist, her expression a mixture of anger and panic. The umbrella lies on the floor, broken. The man says something again, his mouth moving slowly, deliberately. Whatever it is, it makes her shake her head violently, backing away from him. The cashier picks up the phone, fumbling with it. The man sees this and takes another step forward. The woman lunges for the shelves, grabbing a tin of something and throwing it at him. It hits his shoulder, but he doesn't flinch. He's still moving forward, his attention fixed on her now, ignoring the cashier entirely. I feel my heart pick up slightly as I watch. This is the moment. This is where it all unravels. The woman backs up until she hits the shelves behind her, sending a row of crisps cascading to the floor. The cashier shouts something loud and panicked, but it doesn't stop the man. He's close now, reaching out for her. She grabs another tin, swinging wildly, and he catches her arm again, twisting it hard enough that she drops it. She screams again, her voice ragged, and the cashier leaps over the counter, the phone forgotten. The three of them collide in a tangle of limbs, crashing into the shelves. The lights overhead flicker briefly, just once, and I smile. The forecourt was quiet again, the way it usually got after 2 in the morning. The only sounds were the occasional hiss of tires from the motorway beyond the trees and the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights inside. I sat behind the counter, staring at the CCTV screens mounted above me. There was nothing to see except the pumps, empty and glinting in the rain. The night shifts were mostly like this, still uneventful, but with just enough strangeness now and then to keep you on edge. A fox rooting through the bins, an old man who talked to himself while he filled his tank, the drunk teenagers who'd buy energy drinks and crisps and look at you like you were the weird one. Then there was him. He was one of the regulars, the sort you got to know because they showed up every week without fail, always polite, always calm. He didn't come for petrol, just a sandwich or some crisps and a drink, and then he'd stand at the counter, making small talk while I scanned his things. I'd come to expect him, even like him, in that distant, detached way you like anyone who doesn't give you trouble. So when he pulled up that night, I didn't think much of it at first. His car rolled into the forecourt, headlights sweeping across the pumps, and he parked in the same spot he always did, near the door. But he didn't get out right away. I could see him through the windscreen, sitting there gripping the wheel. When he stepped out, I noticed the dirt on his jeans first. It was smeared across the knees, streaked up the thighs like he'd been crawling through a field. His hands were the same, scratched and muddy, and there was a rip in his jacket sleeve. His face was pale, drawn, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as he walked towards the shop. He pushed through the door quickly, the bell jangling, and his eyes locked on mine. For a moment he just stood there, chest rising and falling, his fingers flexing at his sides. The scratches on his hands caught the light, red and angry. His trainers left faint smudges of mud on the tile floor. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, twisting the cap off as he walked up to the counter. He drank half of it in one go, the liquid running down his chin. Then he placed the empty bottle on the counter, not looking at me, just staring out the window at the dark forecourt. I felt the shift immediately. The silence between us was different. Thick, tense, something I couldn't name but could feel pressing against my ribs. His posture was rigid, his breathing unsteady. I noticed how his hands hovered near the edges of the counter, twitching slightly as if he couldn't decide what to do with them. Then he started pacing, his trainers squeaking faintly on the tile. He was muttering to himself, or maybe just breathing hard. I couldn't tell. He kept glancing back at the window, at the glass doors, his head snapping towards any flicker of movement outside. The whole time he stayed close to the counter like he was tethered to it. I wanted to say something, to ask if he was all right, but the way he moved kept me rooted in place. There was an edge to him now, something wild and unfamiliar. He grabbed his empty bottle and crushed it in his hand, the plastic crinkling loudly in the stillness. Then he turned to me, leaning over the counter, his face too close. I caught a whiff of damp earth and sweat, a smell that clung to him like a second skin. His eyes were bloodshot, darting from me to the CCTV monitor above, then back again. He was saying something, mouthing words too fast for me to understand. He pointed outside towards the dark trees beyond the forecourt. His fingers were shaking. That's when I noticed the dirt under his nails wasn't just dirt, it was darker, thicker, like dried blood. It was smeared up his forearms too, faint but there, streaks of it caught in the shallow scratches across his skin. My chest tightened. as he backed away from the counter, pacing again, his movements jerky now, frantic. He knocked over a display of crisps with his elbow, sending packets scattering across the floor. He didn't seem to notice. Then he froze. His head snapped towards the glass doors, his whole body tensing like a coiled spring. I followed his gaze but couldn't see anything out there, just the forecourt bathed in fluorescent light and the dark woods beyond. He reached into his jacket pocket, fumbling for something. His hands were trembling so badly it took him several seconds to pull it out. A phone, cracked and dirty, the screen smeared with fingerprints. He stared at it for a long moment, then hurled it against the floor. It shattered, fragments skidding across the tiles. I flinched, but he didn't seem to care. He was looking at me again, his face pale, his eyes wild. He pointed towards the door, his arm rigid. And then he was moving, stumbling back outside without another glance at me. I stood frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs as I watched him walk across the forecourt. He was heading for his car, but his movements were unsteady, like he might collapse at any moment. He reached the driver's side door, gripping the handle, and stopped. His head turned slightly, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the pumps. I couldn't see what he was looking at, but I could feel it. Something out there, something he knew, but I didn't. He opened the car door and climbed in, slamming it shut. The engine roared to life and the tires screeched as he reversed out of the forecourt, disappearing into the night. I stood there staring at the empty space where his car had been. My hands were shaking, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't until later, when the police arrived, that I learned about the murder. A woman found in the woods just past the motorway, her body buried shallowly in the mud. They asked if I'd seen anything unusual that night. I shook my head and said no. The man came in just before midnight, shoulders hunched as he stepped through the glass doors. He was wearing a jacket that looked too warm for the cool autumn night. His face was flushed, though, like he'd been running or working hard. He grabbed a pack of mints from the rack near the till and tapped his card on the reader before I even had the chance to scan them properly. He didn't leave after that, though. Instead, he hung near the counter, eyes darting to the forecourt outside. I followed his gaze, spotting a black saloon parked by Pump 4. Its hazard lights were blinking faintly in the damp, and the rear tire on the driver's side looked deflated, sagging like a deflated balloon. I thought about calling out to ask if he needed help, but stopped myself when he finally spoke. He gestured towards his car with a quick, sharp motion, miming a flat tire. Then he started moving, pushing the door open again and stepping out into the night without waiting for a response. I sighed and grabbed the keys to the forecourt toolbox. It wasn't the first time I'd had to help someone patch a tire or loosen a stuck bolt, but there was something about this guy that put me on edge. Maybe it was the way he'd barely looked me in the eye, or the way his hand had trembled slightly as he tapped his card. Outside, the forecourt was lit with that harsh white glow that made everything seem starker, more exposed. The black saloon was sleek but dirty, streaks of mud up the sides and across the back bumper. The man stood near the flat tire, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, head tilted slightly as I approached. I crouched down to examine the tire. The rubber wasn't just deflated, it was slashed. 3 clean cuts across the tread, as though someone had taken a knife to it. I looked up, but the man wasn't focused on the tire. He was standing by the boot now, his back to me. The keys in his hand jingled faintly as he unlocked it, the lid lifting with a faint creak. I stood, brushing my hands on my jeans, and glanced towards the boot out of habit. That's when I noticed the plastic tarps. They were folded neatly, but there was a stain on one corner, dark and smudged like old dirt. Next to them were tools, spades, a crowbar, and a pair of bolt cutters. The metal gleamed faintly under the lights, but the wooden handles were streaked with grime. The man shifted slightly, his body angling just enough to block my view. He reached into the boot and pulled out a tire iron, gripping it tightly in one hand. Something in the way he moved made my stomach tighten. There was no reason for him to pull that out yet. The spare tire wasn't even visible. He hadn't taken anything else from the boot, hadn't reached for the jack or the replacement. I took a step back, trying to make it seem casual, as though I was just giving him space. My eyes flicked to his face, but his expression was hard to read. Flat and still, his jaw clenched tight. I asked him something about the spare tire, keeping my voice steady. He didn't respond. Instead, he closed the boot with a solid thud, the sound echoing across the forecourt. He turned to me then, tire iron still in hand. His knuckles were white against the black handle. and his eyes were locked onto mine, sharp and hard. The space between us felt smaller than it should have, the glow of the forecourt lights almost too bright now. My pulse quickened, the hairs on my arms prickling as I forced a half smile and nodded towards the flat. He didn't move. I could feel my breath catching as he took a step forward, the tire iron shifting slightly in his grip. My gaze flicked back towards the shop, the glass doors glinting faintly under the lights. Then he lunged. I stumbled back instinctively, tripping over the edge of the curb and landing hard on the concrete. My hands scraped against the rough surface, stinging as I pushed myself up. The man was on me before I could stand, his movements sharp and erratic. I barely registered the tire iron as it swung down, the sound of metal against concrete ringing out next to my ear. I rolled to the side, my shoulder slamming into the base of the pump as I scrambled to my feet. The man came at me again. His expression twisted into something almost feral now. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a loose spanner from the toolbox, and swung it blindly, catching him on the arm. He grunted, stumbling back just enough for me to dart towards the shop. The glass doors slid open with a hiss as I bolted inside, slamming them shut behind me and locking them in one swift motion. I turned back towards the forecourt, breathing hard, my chest heaving. The man stood there, just beyond the glass, his chest rising and falling as he stared at me. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back to the car. He tossed the tire iron into the boot, slamming it shut before climbing into the driver's seat. The saloon's engine roared to life, the hazard lights flicking off as it reversed sharply out of the forecourt. Tires squealed against the damp concrete as he sped off into the night, disappearing onto the motorway. I stood there, shaking, my hand still clutching the spanner. The forecourt was empty now, silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. When I finally forced myself to step back outside, the toolbox lay where I'd dropped it. Spanners and wrenches scattered across the ground, but near the pump, just by where the saloon had been parked, was something else. A single black glove, caked in dirt and something darker, lying in a faint smear of red. It was about 2 a.m. when I noticed the car. A silver hatchback, nothing special, parked just a few feet from pump 3. Its headlights were off, but the engine was running, a faint vibration in the air whenever I glanced out at it. I hadn't seen it pull in, but that wasn't unusual. Sometimes on these quiet stretches, your mind skips over the details. The driver hadn't come inside, though, and after a while that began to tug at me. People didn't usually sit out there for long, not in the middle of the night, not on this stretch of road where there wasn't much around. I watched the car from behind the counter for a good half hour. Nothing happened. No flicker of movement through the windscreen, no glimpse of anyone inside, just the faint rumble of the idling engine whenever I stepped close to the glass doors. It was odd, but odd wasn't unheard of during these shifts. The long haulers sometimes pulled in to sleep for a bit, too tired to carry on, or maybe it was someone waiting for another car to show up, meeting someone off the motorway. I busied myself with small tasks, restocking the crisps, wiping the counter, checking the CCTV monitors, even though there was nothing to check. All the while, the car stayed exactly where it was, engine running, windows fogging slightly in the cool night air. After another hour passed, I started to feel it creeping in, the tension, the sense that something about the situation was off. I tried to ignore it, but it pressed at the edges of my focus. Eventually, I decided to go out and have a look. The rain had stopped earlier, leaving the forecourt damp and glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights. I stepped outside, the chill hitting me instantly, and walked towards the hatchback. The engine noise grew clearer as I approached, a low, steady drone that seemed far too loud in the silence of the forecourt. The windows were still fogged, but I could just make out the shape of the driver slumped in the seat, their head tilted back against the rest. I tapped on the glass, my knuckles leaving faint smears in the condensation. No response, the figure didn't move. I glanced around, half expecting someone else to be nearby, but the forecourt was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights overhead and the idle murmur of the engine. When I stepped closer, that's when I saw it. On the driver's side door, just below the handle, was a handprint. dark and smeared, fingers spread wide as though someone had pressed their palm there and dragged it down. It was fresh, the edges still glistening faintly under the lights, and it was unmistakably blood. I froze, my pulse thudding in my ears. The car vibrated faintly beneath the low grumble of the engine, but the figure inside didn't move, didn't shift, didn't react. I leaned closer to the window, my breath clouding the glass as I tried to make out the driver. The fog on the inside blurred most of the details, but something about the shape seemed off. The way the body was slumped, the angle of the head. It wasn't right. I stepped back, my gaze flicking around the forecourt, scanning the empty pumps, the bins near the edge of the lot, the tree line beyond the motorway. Nothing. Just the faint hiss of wind in the branches and the distant growl of a lorry passing on the far side of the road. My gut told me not to open the door, but I couldn't leave it, couldn't ignore it. I reached for the handle, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. The door was locked. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. My mind was racing through possibilities. An accident, a medical emergency, something else I couldn't name. The blood on the door felt like an accusation, a clue that didn't match any of the scenarios I tried to piece together. The figure inside still hadn't moved. I circled the car, the soles of my trainers squeaking faintly on the wet concrete. When I reached the passenger side, I bent down, trying to peer through the fogged window. The seat was empty. No bags, no belongings, no sign of anyone else, just the driver, slumped and still. I straightened up, my breath clouding in the cool air. That's when I noticed the smudges on the ground near the driver's side door, faint streaks of red trailing away from the car, disappearing into the darkness beyond the forecourt. They led towards the trees. I turned back towards the shop, my skin prickling as I stepped quickly towards the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore, that the empty forecourt wasn't so empty. I locked the doors behind me as soon as I stepped inside, the bell jangling faintly. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone, dialing for help. I glanced back at the CCTV monitors as I waited, the screens showing the forecourt from different angles. The car was still there, engine running, windows fogged, but the driver's seat was empty. The SUV rolled into the forecourt just after midnight, gleaming under the harsh lights. It was one of those vehicles that screamed money, shiny black, the kind you'd expect to see outside a private school or a posh estate. The number plate was personalized, a jumble of letters that probably meant something to someone but looked ridiculous to me. The couple got out together, moving in a kind of synchrony, both well-dressed for a midnight petrol station visit. He wore a blazer and loafers. She had on heels and a trench coat cinched tight at the waist. It was odd seeing them there. Most of my customers were tired lorry drivers or kids on their way home from some party. They walked straight to the shop, the man pushing the door open with one hand as the woman stepped in ahead of him. She glanced around, smiling faintly like she'd stepped into a boutique instead of a grimy service station that hadn't been updated since the 90s. I watched them as they moved through the aisles. The man grabbed a roll of duct tape, tossing it casually into the basket she held. Then came a pack of black bin bags, industrial-sized, and 2 bottles of bleach. He added a pair of rubber gloves and a sponge, then stopped, apparently considering something, before adding a second pair of gloves. She held the basket easily, her head tilted slightly as she followed him around. Every now and then she'd laugh. Soft and light, the kind of laugh you'd expect to hear at a dinner party, not in a petrol station in the middle of nowhere. They came to the counter with their basket, the woman setting it down while the man pulled out a leather wallet. His hands were neat, nails clipped short, no sign of dirt or rough work. He glanced at her as he paid, and she smiled back, some private joke passing between them. They left as easily as they came, their shoes tapping lightly on the tile. I watched through the glass as they approached the SUV. She climbed into the passenger seat, crossing her legs neatly, while he opened the back door, placing the shopping bags carefully on the floor. That's when I noticed it. The door frame had a stain, faint but there, smeared across the black paintwork near the handle. It wasn't dirt. Dirt doesn't have that color, that shine under fluorescent light. It was reddish, uneven, like someone had swiped at it with a hand or cloth but hadn't bothered to clean it properly. I stared at it, my mind already trying to reason it away. Maybe it was paint. Maybe they'd scraped something when loading the car earlier. The man slammed the door shut and slid into the driver's seat. The engine purred to life, low and smooth. and the SUV pulled out of the forecourt, its tires crunching faintly on the gravel at the edge of the lot. I stood there for a moment staring at the spot where it had been, the echo of that faint crunch still in my ears. Then I stepped outside. The cool air hit me, clearing the stuffiness of the shop from my head, and I walked to where the SUV had been parked. The tarmac was damp from the earlier drizzle, the puddles glinting faintly under the lights. There was something else there too, though, small, scattered drops, darker than water, forming a loose trail that led from where the SUV had been to the edge of the forecourt. I crouched down, peering at them. They didn't have the watery sheen of rain. They were thicker, darker, almost clotted in some places. I stood and followed the trail to the edge of the forecourt. Beyond that was the road stretching out into the darkness on either side. The trail stopped there, the tarmac slick and black in the faint glow from the forecourt lights. I turned back to the shop, my stomach twisting. As I stepped inside, I glanced at the CCTV monitor behind the counter. The grainy black and white footage showed the forecourt, the pumps, the edge of the road where the SUV had disappeared. I rewound the footage, finding the moment they'd pulled in. The couple moved with the same ease I'd noticed before, their movements calm, practiced. The man handled the shopping like he'd done it 1,000 times, his grip on the duct tape firm but unhurried. Then I noticed something else. When he opened the back door to place the bags inside, there was already something there, something large, covered in black plastic, shoved into the far corner of the boot. It wasn't visible for long, just a glimpse before he shifted, his body blocking the view. I stared at the screen, my eyes fixed on that brief moment. The shape in the boot hadn't moved, hadn't shifted as he loaded the bags. I let the footage play out, watching as they drove off, the back of the SUV disappearing into the darkness. The stain on the doorframe was clear on the screen, a streak of black and red against the gleaming paintwork. I didn't call anyone. I didn't touch the register, didn't clean the counter. I stayed behind the counter until dawn, staring at the CCTV monitors, the faint smudges of red still on my hands where I'd crouched by the forecourt. When my replacement came in, I left without a word. The CCTV footage stayed on the screen behind the counter, looping endlessly, the image of the SUV's stained door flickering faintly in the morning light. It was nearing 2:30 when the teenagers came in. They were loud, though not in the boisterous, drunken sort of way I was used to at that hour. It was something sharper, edged with nervous energy, like they couldn't keep still. 2 lads and 2 girls, all of them in their early 20s, I'd guess. They were in a rusted old estate car that looked like it was held together with duct tape and luck. They drifted through the shop in quick, jerky motions, grabbing bottles of water, a packet of crisps here, a chocolate bar there. Their voices carried across the small shop, a hurried exchange about a game. One of the girls laughed, short and breathless, the sound more like someone trying to fill an awkward silence than actual amusement. The tallest of the lads, with a green hoodie and wild hair, tossed a handful of notes onto the counter. His hand was shaking, the notes crumpled into a tight ball. His knuckles were red, raw. The others hovered near the door, casting glances out to the forecourt as though expecting someone or something. When they piled back into the car, the doors slammed too hard and the tires squealed as they sped off into the night. I stayed behind the counter, watching through the glass as the red glow of their taillights disappeared down the road. I figured that would be the last of them, but there was something about their jittery energy that stuck with me. I told myself it was nothing, just another odd encounter on the night shift. The hours passed and the shop settled back into its usual silence. The CCTV monitors flickered occasionally, the grainy black and white feed capturing the empty forecourt and the dim stretch of road beyond. A single lorry rumbled through, its driver buying a coffee before disappearing into the night. It was nearly dawn when the estate car returned. I recognized the sputtering engine before I spotted the car itself. It pulled into the forecourt too fast, its tires crunching on the loose gravel at the edge of the lot. Only one of them got out this time. It was one of the girls, though it took me a moment to realize it was her. Her hair was damp, stuck to her face in clumps, and her jacket was torn at the shoulder. There were dark streaks smeared across her arms, her hands, even her face. Her jeans were soaked at the knees, clinging to her legs as though she'd been crawling through mud, or something worse. She stepped into the shop, her movements stiff, deliberate. She left streaks on the glass door, handprints that gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights. I stood frozen behind the counter, unsure whether to speak or call someone. She didn't buy anything, she just stood there, breathing hard, her chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. Her eyes darted to the CCTV monitors, then back to me. There was something wild in them, something that didn't belong in a petrol station at nearly 5 in the morning. Finally, she approached the counter. Her hand fumbled at her pocket, pulling out a crumpled map. She spread it across the counter, her fingers trembling as she pointed to a spot near the edge. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I stared at the map, my eyes flicking between the point she was indicating and her face. Her hands were smudged with red, the streaks dried now, but still vivid against her pale skin. When she stepped back from the counter, she left the map behind. Without another glance, she turned and walked out of the shop, the door hissing shut behind her. She climbed back into the car, slamming the door. The engine sputtered to life again, louder than before, and the car lurched forward. I watched as she drove off, the back bumper dragging slightly against the ground, sparks flaring faintly against the tarmac. I turned my attention back to the map. My hands hovered over it for a moment before I pressed it flat against the counter. The spot she'd pointed to was just outside of town, near the old quarry. The streaks she'd left on the map were sticky against my fingers. I stepped away, reaching for the phone, but something stopped me. I glanced at the CCTV monitors, my eyes drawn to the forecourt. The smudged handprints she'd left on the glass door were still there, stark against the pale light of dawn. But there were more of them now. Dozens of handprints overlapping, running in uneven streaks down the glass as though a crowd had pressed against it while I wasn't looking. I turned back towards the door, my heart thudding in my chest. The glass was clean. I stayed just beyond the edge of the forecourt, nestled in the darkness where the sodium lights didn't reach. The rain had eased, but the air still carried the faint scent of wet tarmac and petrol. The car had pulled in hours ago, sliding into the nearest pump. It had sat there ever since, engine off, headlights dead, as though waiting for something. Or someone. The man at the register, early 20s, a touch gangly, had noticed the car almost immediately. I'd seen him look up from behind the counter, a brief flicker of curiosity crossing his face, but no one had stepped out of the vehicle. And eventually, he went back to scrolling on his phone. As the hours stretched, his glances grew more frequent, more uncertain. The station itself was nearly deserted, just the odd driver passing through, filling up and leaving without stepping inside. That's why it had been chosen. Quiet. Unremarkable, easy to control. The cashier finally stepped out from behind the counter, a hesitant move that betrayed the edge of his nerves. His head turned towards the car, and for a moment he froze there, halfway between the counter and the door. I couldn't tell what he was thinking, but I imagined it wasn't far off from curiosity tinged with caution. Then he moved, pushing open the door. The faint chime of the bell carried through the damp air, and I felt a small thrill ripple through me. He was about to see. He walked out, keeping his distance from the car at first. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, shoulders hunched slightly against the drizzle. He called out once, twice, but of course there was no answer. His steps drew him closer, boots scraping faintly against the pavement. The car was nothing special, a dark saloon, streaked with grime from the wet roads, a patch of rust eating at one of the wheel arches. The driver's side window was down just enough to let in the air. As the cashier leaned forward, I saw his shoulders stiffen. The driver was slumped against the steering wheel, his head tilted unnaturally, pressed into the curve of the dashboard, his arms hanging limp at his sides. He looked like he'd fallen asleep there, except for the small detail of the blood. It wasn't much, just a thin trickle from his temple, pooling near the edge of his eyebrow before disappearing into the shadows beneath his face. The angle was wrong for it to have been a sudden injury, something accidental. It was precise. Clean. The cashier stepped back sharply, nearly stumbling over his own feet. He hesitated, torn between the instinct to run and the obligation to do something. He turned on his heel, jogging back to the station. The bell jingled faintly again as he vanished inside. For a long moment I stayed where I was, just beyond the edge of the light. The street beyond the forecourt was silent. A single car passed by, tires hissing over wet asphalt, but it didn't stop. No one ever looked too hard at places like this, not in the dead hours of the night. Through the station's glass front I could see the cashier pacing now, his phone pressed to his ear. His movements were nervous, jerky. He was calling someone, of course. It wouldn't take long for them to arrive. I turned my attention back to the car. The man inside wasn't moving, not even the faint rise and fall that might have betrayed life still lingering. He'd been dead for hours now, long before he ever arrived here. His killers had been quick and efficient, a quiet job on the outskirts of town. The station was just the final touch, a neutral ground, an inconspicuous place to leave him. I wasn't meant to stay, but something about the scene had kept me there, rooted to the shadows. There was a simplicity to it, a cold precision that fascinated me. Blue lights washed across the forecourt. 2 police cars pulled in, their tires crunching faintly as they came to a stop. The cashier stepped out, his arms gesturing as he hurried towards them. He pointed to the car, then back to the station, his face pale even under the harsh lights. The officers moved quickly, spreading out to secure the area. One approached the vehicle, torch in hand, while the other questioned the cashier. The beam of light played over the car, highlighting every detail. The cracked windscreen, the grimy paint, the slumped figure in the driver's seat. I stayed perfectly still, watching the scene unfold. The officer opened the driver's door cautiously, the body sagging slightly as it shifted. He leaned in, examining the wound, his expression tightening. He called out to his partner, gesturing towards the blood on the dashboard, the window, the faint smear near the edge of the steering wheel. I didn't need to hear what he was saying to know what he'd found. The evidence wasn't subtle, a staged scene designed to look like a botched robbery or a sudden act of violence, but to someone with the right eye, the precision was clear. As the officers worked, more lights appeared in the distance. Another car approaching, probably detectives or forensics. The station's isolation wouldn't last much longer. I turned and moved away from the forecourt, my steps silent against the soft ground. The trees swallowed me up, their damp branches brushing against my jacket. The sounds of the station faded behind me, muffled by the weight of the night. I wasn't worried about being caught. No one would ever look for me, not here, not in a place like this.